The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Read live in Second Life by Hugh Carr. Chapters 7 through to 9. Chapter 7, mainly about dwarfs. The two Calormene soldiers at the head of the column, seeing what they took for a Tarkan, or great lord with 2 armed pages, came to a halt and raised their spears in salute.
"O my master," said one of them, "we lead these mannikins to Calormen to work in the mines of the Tisroc. May he live forever."
"By the great god Tash, they are very obedient," said Tyrion. Then suddenly he turned to the dwarfs themselves. About 1 in 6 of them carried a torch, and by that flickering light he could see their bearded faces all looking at him with grim and dogged expressions. "Has the Tisroc fought a great battle, dwarfs, and conquered your land?" he asked, "that thus you go patiently to die in the salt pits of Pugruhan?" The 2 soldiers glared at him in surprise, but the dwarfs all answered, Aslan's orders, he sold us. What can we do against him?" "Tisroc indeed," added one and spat. "I'd like to see him try it." "Silence, dog," said the chief soldier. "Look," said Tyrion, pulling Puzzle forward into the light. "It has all been a lie. Aslan has not come to Narnia at all. You have been cheated by the ape. This is the thing he brought out of the stable to show you. Look at it." What the dwarf saw, now that they could see it close, was certainly enough to make them wonder how they had ever been taken in. The lion's skin had got pretty untidy already during Puzzle's long imprisonment in the stable, and it had been knocked crooked during the journey through the dark wood. Most of it was in a big lump on one shoulder. The head, besides being pushed sideways, had somehow got very far back so that anyone could see how this silly, gentle, donkeyish face was gazing out of it. Some grass stuck in one corner of his mouth, for he'd been doing a little quiet nibbling as they brought him along. And he was muttering, "It wasn't my fault. I'm not clever. I never said I was." For 1 second all the dwarfs were staring at Puzzle with wide-open mouths, and then one of the soldiers said sharply, "Master, are you mad? What are you doing to the slaves?" And the other said, "Who are you?" Neither of their spears were at the salute now. Both were down and ready for action. "Give the password," said the chief soldier. "This is my password," said the king as he drew his sword. "The light is dawning, the lie broken. Now guard thee, miscreant, for I am Tyrion of Narnia." He flew upon the chief soldier like lightning. Eustace, who had drawn his sword when he saw the king draw his, rushed at the other one. His face was deadly pale, but I wouldn't blame him for that. And he had the luck that beginners sometimes do have. He forgot all that Tyrion had tried to teach him that afternoon, slashed wildly, indeed I'm not sure his eyes weren't shut, and suddenly found to his own great surprise that the Calormene lay dead at his feet. And though it was a great relief, it was, at the moment, rather frightening. The king's fight lasted a second or 2 longer. Then he too had killed his man and shouted to Eustace, "Where are the other 2?" But the dwarfs had settled the 2 remaining Calormenes. There was no enemy left. "Well struck, Eustace," cried Tyrion, clapping him on the back. "Now, dwarfs, you are free. Tomorrow I will lead you to free all Narnia. 3 cheers for Aslan!" But the result which followed was simply wretched. There was a feeble attempt from a few dwarfs, about 5, which died away all at once. From several of the others there were sulky growls. Many said nothing at all.
"Don't they understand?" said Jill impatiently. "What's wrong with all you dwarfs? Don't you hear what the king says? It's all over. The ape isn't going to rule Narnia any longer. Everyone can go back to an ordinary life. You can have fun again. Aren't you glad?"
After a pause of nearly a minute, a not very nice-looking dwarf with hair and beard as black as soot said, "And who might you be, missy?"
"I'm Jill," she said, "the same Jill who rescued King Rilian from the enchantment, and this is Eustace who did it too. We've come back from another world after hundreds of years. Aslan sent us."
The dwarfs all looked at one another with grins. Sneering grins, not merry ones. "Well," said the black dwarf, whose name was Griffle, "I don't know how you chaps feel, but I feel I've heard as much about Aslan as I want to for the rest of my life." That's right, growled the other dwarfs. "It's all a plant, a bloomin' plant." "What do you mean?" said Tyrion. He had not been pale when he was fighting, but he was pale now. He had thought this was going to be a beautiful moment, but it was turning out more like a bad dream. "You must think we're blooming soft in the head, you must," said Griffle. "We've been taken in once, and you expect us to be taken in the next minute. We've no more use for stories about Aslan, see? Look at him, an old mork with long ears." "By heaven, you make me mad," said Tyrion. "Which of us said that was Aslan? That is the ape's imitation of the real Aslan. Can't you understand?" "And you've got a better imitation, I suppose," said Griffle. "No, thanks. We've been fooled once, and we're not going to be fooled again." "I have not," said Tyrion angrily. "I serve the real Aslan." "Where's he? Who's he? Show him to us," said several of the dwarfs. "Do you think I keep him in my wallet, fools?" said Tyrion. "Who am I that could make Aslan appear at my bidding? He's not a tame lion." The moment those words were out of his mouth, he realized that he had made a false move. The dwarfs once again began repeating, "Not a tame lion, not a tame lion," in a jeering sing-song. "That's what the other lot kept on telling us," said one. "Do you mean you don't believe in the real Aslan?" said Jill. "But I've seen him, and he has sent two of us here out of a different world." "Ah," said Griffle with a broad smile. "So you say. They've taught you your stuff all right. Saying your lessons, aren't you?" "Jill," cried Tyrion, "will you give the lady the lie to her very face?" "You keep a civil tongue in your head, mister," replied the dwarf. "I don't think we want any more kings. If you are Tyrion, you don't look like him, no more than we want any Aslans. We're going to look after ourselves from now on, and touch our caps to nobody, see?" "That's right," said the other dwarfs. "We're on our own now. No more Aslan, no more kings, no more silly stories about other worlds. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." And they all began to fall into their place and get ready for marching back to wherever they had come from.
"Little beasts," said Eustace. "Aren't you even going to say thank you for being saved from the salt mines?" "Oh, we don't know about that," said Griffle over his shoulder. "You wanted to make use of us. That's why you rescued us. You're playing some game of your own. Come on, you chaps."
And the dwarfs struck up a queer little marching song, which goes with the drum beat, and off they tramped into the darkness. Tyrion and his friends stared after them. Then he said the single word, "Come," and they continued their journey. They were a silent party. Basil felt himself to be still in disgrace, and also he didn't really quite understand what had happened. Jill, besides being disgusted with the dwarfs, was very impressed with Eustace's victory over the Calormen, and felt almost shy. As for Eustace, his heart was still beating rather quickly. Tyrion and Jewel walked sadly in the rear. The king had his arm on the unicorn's shoulder, and sometimes the unicorn nuzzled the king's cheek with his soft nose. They did not try to comfort one another with words. It wasn't very easy to think of anything to say that would be comforting. Tyrion had never dreamed that one of the results of the apes setting up the false Aslan would be to stop people from believing in the real one. He had felt quite sure that the dwarfs would rally to his side, the moment he showed them how they'd been deceived. And then next night he would have led them to Stable Hill and shown Puzzle and all the creatures, and everyone would have turned against the ape, and perhaps after a scuffle with Calormenes, the whole thing would have been over. But now it seemed he could count on nothing. How many other Narnians might turn the same way as the dwarfs?
"Somebody's coming after us, I think,"
said Puzzle suddenly. They stopped and listened. Sure enough, there was a thump, thump of small feet behind them. "Who goes there?" shouted the king.
"Only me, sire," came a voice. "Me, Poggin the dwarf. I've only just managed to get away from the others. I'm on your side, sire, and I'm on Aslan's. If you could put a dwarfish sword in my fist, I'd gladly strike a blow on the right side before it's all done."
Everyone crowded round him and welcomed him and praised him and slapped him on the back. Of course, one single dwarf could not make a very great difference, but it was somehow very cheering to have even one. The whole party brightened up. But Jill and Eustace didn't stay bright for very long, for they were now yawning their heads off and too tired to think about anything but bed. It was the coldest hour of the night, just before dawn, that they got back to the tower. If there had been a meal ready for them, they would have been glad enough to eat it, but the bother and delay of getting one was not to be thought of. They drank from a stream, splashed their faces with water, and tumbled into their bunks, except for Puzzle and Jewel, who said they'd be more comfortable outside. This perhaps was just as well, for a unicorn and a fat, full-grown donkey indoors always make a room feel rather crowded. Narnian dwarfs, though less than 4 feet high, are for their size about the toughest and strongest creatures there are, so that Poggin, in spite of a heavy day and a late night, woke fully refreshed before any of the others. He at once took Jill's bow, went out, and shot a couple of wood pigeons. Then he sat plucking them on the doorstep and chatting to Jewel and Puzzle. Puzzle looked and felt a good deal better this morning. Jewel, being a unicorn, and therefore one of the noblest and delicatest of beasts, had been very kind to him, talking to him about things of the sort they could both understand, like grass and sugar and the care of one's hoofs. When Jill and Eustace came out of the tower yawning and rubbing their eyes, and almost 10:30 it was, the dwarf showed them where they could gather plenty of Narnian weed called wild frenzy, which looks rather like our wood sorrel, but tastes a good deal nicer when cooked. Needs a little butter and pepper to make it perfect, but they hadn't got these. So that what with one thing and another, they had the makings of a capital stew for their breakfast, or dinner, whichever you should choose it. Tyrion went a little farther off into the wood with an axe and brought back some branches for fuel. While the meal was cooking, which seemed a very long time, especially as it smelled nicer and nicer the nearer it came to being done, the king found a complete dwarfish outfit for Poggin: mail shirt, helmet, shield, sword, belt, and dagger. Then he inspected Eustace's sword and found that Eustace had put it back in the sheath all messy from killing the Calormene. He was scolded for that and made to clean and polish it. All this while, Jill went to and fro, sometimes stirring the pot and sometimes looking out enviously at the donkey and the unicorn who were contentedly grazing. How many times that morning she wished she could eat grass. But when the meal came, everyone felt it was worth waiting for, and there were second helpings all round. When everyone had eaten as much as he could, the 3 humans and the dwarf came and sat on the doorstep, and the 4-footed ones lay down facing them. The dwarf, with permission both from Jill and from Tyrion, lit his pipe, and the king said, "Now, friend Poggin, you have more news of the enemy belike than we. Tell us all you know, and first, what tale do they tell of my escape?" "A cunning tale, sire, as ever was devised," said Poggin. "It was the cat, Ginger, who told it, and most likely made it up too. This Ginger, sire, he's a sly boots if ever a cat was, said he was walking past the tree to which those villains bound your majesty.
And he said, saving your reverence, that you are howling and swearing and cursing aslan. Language like I wouldn't want to repeat, were the words he used, looking so ever prim and proper. You know the way that a cat can when he pleases. And then, says Ginger, Aslan himself suddenly appeared in a flash of lightning and swallowed your majesty up in one mouthful. All the beasts trembled at this story, and some fainted right away. And of course the ape followed it up. There he says, see what Aslan does to those who don't respect him. Let that be a warning to you all. And the poor creatures wailed and whined and said, it will, it will. So that in the upshot your majesty's escape was not set them thinking whether you'll still have loyal friends to aid you, but only that has made them more afraid and more obedient to the ape. What devilish policy, said Tyrion. This Ginger, then, is close in the ape's councils. It's more of a question by now, sire, if the ape is in his councils, replied the dwarf. The ape has taken to drinking, you see. My belief is that the plot is now mostly carried on by Ginger or Richter, that's the Calamine captain. And I think some words that Ginger has scattered among the dwarfs are chiefly to blame for the scurvy return they made you. And I'll tell you why. One of those dreadful midnight meetings had just broken up the last night, and I'd gone a bit of the way home when I found I'd left my pipe behind. It was a real good one and an old favourite, so I went back to look for it. But before I could place where I'd been sitting, it was black as pitch there, I heard a cat's voice say mew, and the Clomine say, here, speak softly. So I just stood as still as if I was frozen. And then these two were Ginger and Richter Tarkan, as they call him. Noble Tarkan, said the cat in that silky voice of his, I just wanted to know exactly what we both meant today about Aslan being no more than Tash. Doubtless more sagacious of cats, says the other. You've perceived my meaning. You mean, says Ginger, that there's no such person as either? All that are enlightened know that, said the Tarkan. Then we can understand one another, purrs the cat. Do you, like me, grow a little weary of the ape? A stupid, greedy brute, says the other, but we must use him for the present. Thou and I must provide for all things in secret and make the ape do our will. And it would be better, wouldn't it, said Ginger, to let some of the more enlightened Narnians into our councils. One by one we find them apt. For the beasts who really believe in Aslan may turn at any moment, and will if the ape's folly betrays his secret. And those who care neither for Tash nor Aslan, but only have an eye for their own profit and such reward as the Tisroc may give them when Narnia is in Calomine province, will be firm. Excellent cat, said the captain, but choose which ones carefully. While the dwarf had been speaking, the day seemed to have changed. It had been sunny when they sat down. Now Puzzle shivered. Jewel shifted his head uneasily. Jill looked up. It's clouding over, she said. It's so cold, said Puzzle. Cold enough by the lion, said Tyrion, blowing on his hands. And faugh! What foul smell is this? Phew! Gasped Eustace. It's like something dead. Is there a dead bird somewhere about? And why didn't we notice it before? With a great upheaval, Jules scrambled to his feet and pointed with his horn. Then all six of them saw, and over all their faces there came an expression of uttermost dismay. Chapter 8. What news the eagle brought. In the shadow of the trees on the far side of the clearing, something was moving. It was gliding very slowly northward. At first sight you might have mistaken it for smoke, for it was grey, and you could see things through it. But the deathly smell was not the smell of smoke.
Also, this thing kept its shape instead of billowing and curling as smoke would have done. It was roughly the shape of a man, but it had the head of a bird, some bird of prey with a cruel, curved beak. It had 4 arms which it held high above its head, stretching them out northwards as if it wanted to snatch all Narnia in its grasp. And its fingers, all 20 of them, were curved like its beak, and had long, pointed bird-like claws instead of nails. It floated on the grass instead of walking, and the grass seemed to wither beneath it. After one look at it, Puzzle gave a screaming bray and darted into the tower, and Jill, who was no coward, as you know, hid her face in her hands to shut out the sight of it. The others watched it for perhaps a minute until it streamed away into the thicker trees onto their right and disappeared. Then the sun came out again, and the birds once more began singing. Everyone started breathing properly again and moved. They had all been still as statues when it had been in sight.
"What was it?"
said Eustace in a whisper.
"I have seen it once before," said Tyrion, "but that time it was carved in stone and overlaid with gold and had solid diamonds for eyes. It was when I was no older than thou, and had gone as a guest to the Tisrock's court in Tashbaan. He took me into the great temple of Tash. There I saw it, carved above the altar." "Then that thing was Tash," said Eustace.
But instead of answering him, Tyrion slipped his arm behind Jill's shoulders and said, "How is it with you, lady?"
All right,"
said Jill, taking her hands away from her pale face and trying to smile.
I'm all right. It only made me feel a little sick for a moment." "It seems, then," said the unicorn, "that there is a real Tash after all." "Yes," said the dwarf, "and this fool of an ape who didn't believe in Tash will get more than he bargained for. He called for Tash. Tash has come." "Where has the thing gone to?"
said Jill. "North, into the heart of Narnia," said Tyrion. "It has come to dwell among us. They have called it, and it has come."
"Ho, ho, ho," chuckled the dwarf, rubbing his hairy hands together. "It will be a surprise for the ape. People shouldn't call for demons unless they really mean what they say."
"Who knows if Tash will be visible to the ape?" said Jewel. "Where's Puzzle got to?" said Eustace.
They all shouted out Puzzle's name, and Jill went around to the other side of the tower to see if he had gone there. They were quite tired of looking for him when at last his grey head peered cautiously out of the doorway, and he said, "Has it gone away?" And when at last they got him to come out, he was shivering the way a dog shivers before a thunderstorm.
"I see now," said Puzzle, "that I've been a really bad donkey. I ought never to have listened to Shift. I never thought things like this would begin to happen."
"If you'd spent less time saying you weren't clever and more time trying to be as clever as you could be," began Eustace, but Jill interrupted him. "Oh, leave poor old Puzzle alone," she said. "It was all a mistake, wasn't it, Puzzle dear?" And she kissed him on the nose. Though rather shaken by what he had seen, the whole party now sat down and went on with their talk. Jewel had little to tell them. While he was a prisoner, he had spent nearly all his time tied up in the back of the stable, and had of course heard none of the enemy's plans. He'd been kicked, and he'd done some kicking back too, and beaten and threatened with death unless he would say that he believed it was Aslan who was brought out and shown to them by firelight every night. In fact, he was going to be executed this very morning if they had not rescued him. He didn't know what had happened to the lamb. The question that they had to decide was whether they should go to Stable Hill again that night, show Puzzle to the Narnians, and try to make them see how they'd been tricked,
or whether they should steal away eastwards to meet the help which Runewit the centaur was bringing up from Caer Paravel, and return against the ape and the Calormenes in force. Tyrion would very much like to have followed the first plan. He hated the idea of leaving the ape to bully his people one moment longer than needed to be. On the other hand, the way the dwarfs had behaved last night was a warning. Apparently one couldn't be sure how people would take it, even if they showed them puzzle. And there were the Calormene soldiers to be reckoned with. Poggin thought that there were about 30 of them. Tyrion felt sure that if the Narnians all rallied to his side, he and Jewel and the children and Poggin, puzzle didn't count for much, would have a good chance of beating them. But how if half the Narnians, including all the dwarfs, just sat and looked on, or even fought against him? The risk was too great. And there was, too, the cloudy shape of Tash. What might it do? And then, as Poggin pointed out, there was no harm in leaving the ape to deal with his own difficulties for a day or two. He would have no puzzle to bring out and show for now. It wasn't easy to see what the story he or Ginger would make up to explain that. If the beasts asked night after night to see Aslan, and no Aslan was brought out, surely even the simplest of them would get suspicious. In the end, they all agreed that the best thing to do was to try to meet up with Runewit. As soon as they had decided this, it was wonderful how much more cheery everyone became. I don't honestly think that this was because any of them was afraid of a fight, except perhaps Jill and Eustace, but I dare say that each of them deep down inside was very glad not to go any nearer, or not yet, to that horrible bird-headed thing which, visible or invisible, was now probably haunting Stable Hill. Anyway, one always feels better when one has made up one's mind. Thank you very much for the tips, people. I really appreciate it. Tyrion said that they had better remove their disguises, as they didn't want to be mistaken for Calormenes and perhaps attacked by any loyal Narnians they might meet. The dwarf made up a horrid-looking mess of ashes from the hearth and grease out of the jar of grease, which was kept for rubbing on swords and spearheads. Then they took the Calormene armour and went down to the stream. The nasty mixture made a rather nice lather, just like a soft soap. It was pleasant, homely sight to see Tyrion and the two children kneeling beside the water and scrubbing their backs, puffing and blowing as they splashed the lather off. Then they went back to the tower with red, shiny faces, looking like people who have been given an extra special good wash before a party. They rearmed themselves in true Narnian style with straight swords and three-cornered shields. "Body of me," said Tyrion, "that is better. I feel a true man again." Puzzle begged very hard to have the lion skin taken off him. He said it was too hot, and the way it was rucked up on his back was uncomfortable. Also it made him look so silly. But they told him he would have to wear it a little bit longer, for they still wanted to show him in that get-up to the other beasts, even though they were now going to meet Runewit first. What was left of the pigeon meat and rabbit meat was not worth bringing away, but they took some biscuits. Then Trinian locked the door of the tower, and that was the end of their stay there. It was a little after 2 in the afternoon when they set out, and it was first really warm, as it can be in spring. The young leaves seemed to be much farther out than today. The snowdrops were over, but they saw several primroses. The sunlight slanted through the trees, birds sang, and always, though usually out of sight, there was the noise of running water. It was hard to think of horrible things like Tash. The children felt, this is really Narnia at last. Even Tyrion's heart grew lighter as he walked ahead of them, humming an old Narnian marching song, which had the refrain, "Ho, rumble, 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 drum belabored." After the king came Eustace and Poggin the dwarf. Poggin was telling Eustace the names of all the Narnian trees, birds, and plants that he didn't know already. Sometimes Eustace would tell him about the English ones. After them came Puzzle, and after him Jill and Jewel, walking very close together. Jill had, as you might say, quite fallen in love with the unicorn. She thought, and she wasn't far wrong, that he was the shiningest, delicatest, most graceful animal she had ever met, and he was so gentle and soft of speech that, if you hadn't known, you could hardly now believe how fierce and terrible he could be in battle.
"Oh, this is nice," said Jill. "Just walking along like this. I wish there could be more of this sort of adventure. It's a pity there's always so much happening in Narnia."
But the unicorn explained to her that she was quite mistaken. He said that the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were brought out of their own strange worlds into Narnia only at times when Narnia was stirred and upset. But you mustn't think it was always like that. In between their visits there were hundreds and thousands of years when peaceful king followed peaceful king, till you could hardly remember their names and count their numbers, and there was really hardly anything to put into the history books. And he went on to talk of the old queens and heroes whom she had never heard of. He spoke of Swan White, the queen who had lived before the days of the White Witch and the Great Winter, who was so beautiful that when she looked into any forest pool, the reflection of her face shone out of the water like a star by night for a year and a day afterwards. He spoke of Moonwood the hare, who had such ears that he could sit by Cauldron Pool under the thunder of the great waterfall and hear what men spoke in whispers at Caer Paravel. He told how King Gale, who was the 9th in descent from Frank, the first of all kings, had sailed far away into the eastern seas and delivered the Lone Islands from a dragon, and how in return they had given him the Lone Islands to be part of the royal lands of Narnia forever. He talked of whole centuries in which all Narnia was so happy, and notable dances and feasts, or at most tournaments, were the only things that could be remembered, and every day and week had been better than the last. And as he went on, the picture of all those happy years, all the thousands of them piled up high in Jill's mind, till it was rather like looking down from on a high hill into a rich, lovely plain full of woods and waters and cornfields, which spread away and away till it got thin and misty in the distance. And she said, "Oh, I do hope we can soon settle the ape and get back to these good ordinary times. And then I hope they'll go on and on for ever and ever and ever. Our world is going to have to end some day. Perhaps this one won't. Oh, Jewel, won't it be lovely if Narnia just went on and on, like you said it had been?" "Nay, sister," answered Jewel. "All worlds draw to an end, except Aslan's own country."
"Well, at least," said Jill, "I hope the end of this one is millions and millions and millions of years away. Hello, what are we stopping for?"
The king and Eustace and the dwarfs were all staring up at the sky. Jill shuddered, remembering what horrors they had seen already. But it was nothing of that sort this time. It was small, and looked black against the blue.
"I dare swear," said the unicorn, "from its flight, that is a talking bird." "So I think," said the king, "but it is a friend. Or is it a spy of the apes?" "To me, sire," said the dwarf, "it has the look of Farsight the eagle." "Ought we to hide under the trees?" said Eustace.
"Nay," said Tyrion. "Best stand still as rocks. He would see us for certain if we moved."
"Look, he wheels. He has seen us already," said Jewel. "He's coming down in wide circles."
"Arrow on the string, lady," said Tyrion to Jewel. "But by no means shoot till I bid you. He may be a friend." If one had known what was going to happen next, it would have been a treat to watch the grace and ease with which the huge bird glided down. He alighted on a rocky crag a few feet from Tyrion, bowed his crested head, and said in his strange eagle's voice, "Hail, King!" "Hail, Farsight," said Tyrion. "And since you call me king,
I may well believe you are not a follower of the ape and this false Aslan. Am I right glad of your coming?"
"Sire," said the eagle, "when you have heard my news, you will be sorrier of my coming than of the greatest woe that ever befell you."
Tyrion's heart seemed to stop beating at these words, but he set his teeth and said, "Tell on."
"Two sights have I seen," said Farsight. "One was Caer Paravel filled with dead Narnians and living Calormenes. The Tisrock's banner advanced upon your royal battlements, and your subjects flying from the city this way and that into the woods. Caer Paravel has taken from the sea 20 great ships of Calormen put in there in the dark of the night before last night."
No one could speak.
"And the other sight, 5 leagues nearer than Caer Paravel, was Runwit the centaur lying dead with a Calormene arrow in his side. I was with him in his last hour, and he gave me this message to your majesty, to remember that all worlds draw to an end, and that noble death is a treasure which no one is too poor to buy."
"So," said the king after a long silence, "Narnia is no more." Chapter 9. The Great Meeting on Stable Hill. For a long time they did not speak nor even shed a tear. Then the unicorn stamped the ground with his hoof and shook his mane and spoke.
"Sire," he said, "there is now no need of counsel. We see that the ape's plans were laid deeper than we dreamed of. Doubtless he has been in long secret traffic with the Tisrock, and as soon as he found the lion's skin, he sent him word to make ready his navy for the taking of Caer Paravel and all Narnia. Nothing now remains for us 7 but to go back to Stable Hill, proclaim the truth, and take the adventure that Aslan sends us. And if, by a great marvel, we defeat those 30 Calormenes who are with the ape, then to turn again and die in battle with the far greater host of them that will soon march from Caer Paravel."
Tyrion nodded, but he turned to the children and said, "Now, friends, it is time for you to go hence into your own world. Doubtless you have done all that you were sent to do."
But we've done nothing,"
said Jill, who was shivering, not exactly with fear, but because everything was so horrible. "Nay," said the king, "you loosed me from that tree. You glided before me like a snake last night in the wood and took Puzzle. And you, Eustace, killed your man. But you were too young to share in such a bloody end as we others must meet tonight. It may be 3 days hence. I entreat you, nay, I command you, to return to your own place. I should put it to shame if I was to let such a young warrior fall in battle by my side."
No, no, no,"
said Jill, very white when she began speaking, and then turning very red and then white again.
"We won't. I don't care what you say. We're going to stick to you whatever happens, aren't we, Eustace?"
"Yes, but there's no need to get so worked up about it," said Eustace, who stuck his hands in his pockets, forgetting how very odd it looks when you're trying to do that wearing a mail shirt.
"Because you see, we haven't any choice. What's the good of talking about us going back? How? We've got no magic for doing it."
This was very good sense, but at that moment Jill hated Eustace for it. He was fond of being dreadfully matter-of-fact when other people were getting excited. When Tyrion realized that the 2 strangers could not get home unless Aslan suddenly whisked them away, he next wanted them to go across the southern mountains into Archenland, where they might possibly be safe. But they didn't know their way, and there was no one to send them with. Also, as Poggins said, once the Calormenes had Narnia, they would certainly take Archenland in the next week or so. The Tisrock had always wanted to have these Narnian countries for his own.
In the end, Eustace and Jill begged so hard that Trinian said that they could come with him and take their chance, or, as he much more sensibly called it, the adventure that Aslan would send them. The king's first idea was that they should not go back to Stable Hill. They were sick of the very name of it now, till after dark. But the dwarf told them that if they arrived there by daylight, they would probably find the place deserted, except perhaps for a Calormene sentry. The beasts were far too frightened by what the ape and Ginger had told them about this new, angry Aslan, or Tashlan, to go near it, except for when they were being called together for those horrible midnight meetings. And Calormenes are never good woodsmen. Poggin thought that even by daylight they could easily get round to somewhere behind the stable without being seen. This would be much harder to do when the night had come, and the ape might be calling the beasts together and all the Calormenes were on duty, and when the meeting did begin, they could leave Puzzle at the back of the stable, completely out of sight, to the moment that they wanted to produce him. This was obviously a good thing, for their only chance was to give the Narnians a sudden surprise. Everyone agreed, and the whole party set off in a new line, northwest towards the hated hill. The eagle sometimes flew to and fro above them, sometimes he perched on Puzzle's back. No one, not even the king himself, except in some great need, would dream of riding on a unicorn. This time Jill and Eustace walked together. They had been feeling very brave when they were begging to be allowed to come with the others, but now they didn't feel brave at all.
"Poe,"
said Eustace in a whisper,
"I may as well tell you I've got the wind up." "Oh, you're all right," said Scrub.
Try again.
"Oh, you're all right, Scrub," said Jill. "You can fight, but I'm just shaking, if you want to know the truth." "Oh, shaking's nothing," said Eustace. "I'm feeling I'm going to be sick." "Don't talk about that, for goodness sake," said Jill.
They went on in silence for a minute or two.
"Poe,"
said Eustace presently.
"What?"
said she.
"What'll happen if we get killed here?" "Well, we'll be dead, I suppose." "But I mean, what will happen in our own world? Shall we wake up and find ourselves back in that train? Or shall we just vanish and never be heard of any more? Or shall we be dead in England?" "Gosh, I never thought of that." "It'll be rum for Peter and the others if they saw me waving out of the window and then the train comes in and we're nowhere to be found. Or if they found if we're dead over there in England." "Oh," said Jill, "what a horrible idea." "Well, it wouldn't be horrid for us," said Eustace. "We shouldn't be there." "I almost wish—" "No, I don't, though," said Jill. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say that I wished we'd never come. But I don't. Even if we are killed, I'd rather be killed fighting for Narnia than grow old and stupid at home, and perhaps go on in a bath chair and then die in the end just the same. Or as smashed up by British railways." "Why do you say that?" "Well, when that awful jerk came, the one that seemed to throw us into Narnia, I thought it was the beginning of a railway accident. I was jolly glad to find ourselves here instead."
While Jill and Eustace were talking about this, the others were discussing their plans and becoming less miserable. That was because they were now thinking of what was to be done this very night, and the thought of what had happened to Narnia, the thought of all her glories and joys were pushed away into the back of their minds. The moment they stopped talking, it would come and make them wretched again. But they kept on talking. Pogging was really quite cheerful about the night's work they had to do. He was sure that Boar and the bear and probably all the dogs would come over to their side at once, and he couldn't believe that all the other dwarfs would stick to Griffle. And fighting by firelight and in and out among the trees, they would have an advantage to the weaker side. And then, if they could win tonight, Need they really throw their lives away by meeting the main Calormene army a few days later? Why not hide in the woods, or even up in the western waste beyond the great waterfall and live like outlaws? And then they might gradually get stronger and stronger, for talking beasts and Archenlanders would be joining them every day. And at last they could come out of hiding and sweep the Calormenes, who had been gotten careless by then, out of the country, and Narnia would be revived. After all, something very like that had happened in the time of King Miraz. And Tyrion heard all this and thought, but what about Tash? And he felt in his bones that none of it was going to happen. But he didn't say so. When they got nearer to Stable Hill, of course everyone became quiet. Then the real woodwork began. From the moment at first they saw the hill to the moment which they arrived at the back of the stable, it took them over 2 hours. It was the sort of thing one couldn't describe properly unless one wrote pages and pages about it. The journey from each bit of cover to the next was a separate adventure, and there was a very long wait in between, and several false alarms. If you're a good scout or a good guide, you'll know already what that might have been like. By about sunset they were all safe in a clump of holly trees about 15 yards from the stable. They all munched some biscuit and lay down. Then came the worst part, the waiting. Luckily for the children, they slept for a couple of hours, but of course they woke up when the night grew cold, and what's worse, woke up very thirsty and with no chance of getting a drink. Puzzle just stood, shivering a little with nervousness, and said nothing. But Trinian, with his head against Jules' flank, slept as sound as if he were in his royal bed at Caer Paravel, till the sound of a gong beating awoke him, and he sat up and saw that there was firelight on the far side of the stable, and knew that the hour had come. "Kiss me, Jule," he said, "for certainly this is our last night on earth. And if ever I offended you in any matter great or small, forgive me now." "Dear King," said the unicorn, "I could almost wish you had, so that I might forgive it. Farewell. We have known great joys together. If Aslan gave me my choice, I would choose no other life than the life I have had with you, and no other death than the one that we go to." Then they woke up Farsight, who was asleep with his head under his wing. It made him look like he had no head at all, and crept forward to the stable. They left Puzzle, not without a kind word, for no one was angry with him now, just behind it, telling him not to move till they came to fetch him, and took up their position at one end of the stable. The bonfire had not been lit for long, and was just beginning to blaze up. It was only a few feet away from them, and the great crowd of Narnian creatures were on the other side of it, so that Trinian could not at first see them very well, though of course he saw dozens of eyes shining with the reflection of the fire, as you've seen a rabbit or a cat's eyes in the headlights of a car. And just as Trinian took his place, the gong stopped beating, and from somewhere on his left 3 figures appeared. One was Rishtatar Khan, the Calormene captain. The second was the ape. He was holding on to the Tarkhan's hand with one paw, and kept whimpering and muttering,
"Not so fast! Don't go so fast! I'm not at all well. Oh, my poor head! These midnight meetings are getting too much for me. Apes aren't meant to be up all night. It's not as if I was a rat or a bat. Oh, my poor head!"
On the other side of the ape, walking very softly and stately, with its tail straight up in the air, came Ginger the cat. They were leading for the bonfire, and were so close to Trinian that they could have seen him at once if they had looked in the right direction. Fortunately they did not, but Trinian heard Rishta say to Ginger in a low voice, "Now, cat, to thy boast. See that thou play thy part well." Meow, meow, count on me, said Ginger. Then he stepped away beyond the bonfire and sat down in the front row of the assembled beasts, in the audience, as you might say. For really, as it happened, the whole thing was rather like a theatre. The crowd of Narnians were like the people in the seats. The little grassy place, just in front of the stable where the bonfire burned and the ape and the captain stood to talk to the crowd, was like the stage. The stable itself was like the scenery at the back of the stage, and Tyrion and his friends were like the people peering round from behind the scenery. It was a splendid position. If any of them had stepped forward into the full firelight, all eyes would be fixed on him at once. On the other hand, so long as they stood still in the shadows at the end wall of the stable, it was 100 to 1 against them ever being noticed. Rishta Tarkan dragged the ape up close to the fire. The pair of them turned their face to the crowd, and this was of course meant that their backs were towards Trinian and his friends.
Now, monkey, said Rishta Tarkan in a low voice, say the words that wiser heads have put into your mouth, and hold up thy head.
And as he spoke, he gave the ape a little prod or kick from behind with the point of his toe.
Do leave me alone,
muttered Shift, but he sat up straighter and began in a louder voice.
Now, listen, all of you. A terrible thing has happened. A wicked thing. The wickedest thing that has ever been done in Narnia. And Aslan...
Tashlan, the fool,
whispered Rishta Tarkan.
Tashlan, I mean, of course, said the ape. He is very angry about it.
There was a terrible silence while the beasts waited to hear what new trouble was in store for them. The little party at the end wall of the stable also held their breath. What on earth was coming now?
Yes, said the ape. At this moment, when the terrible one himself is among us, there in the stable just behind me, one wicked beast has chosen to do what you'd think no one would dare to do, even if he were 1,000 miles away. He has dressed himself up in a lion's skin, and is wandering about in these very woods, pretending to be Aslan.
Jill wondered for a moment if the ape had gone mad. Was he going to tell the whole truth? A roar of horror and rage went up from the beasts.
Grrr! Came the growls. Who is he? Who is he? Just let me get my teeth into him.
It was seen last night,
screamed the ape.
But it got away. It's a donkey, a common miserable ass. If any of you see that ass...
Grrr!
Growled the beasts.
We will! We will! He better keep out of our way!
Jill looked at the king. His mouth was open and his face was full of horror, and then she understood the devilish cunning of the enemy's plan. By mixing a little truth with it, they had made their lie far stronger. What was the good now of telling the beasts that an ass had been dressed up as a lion to deceive them? The ape would only say, "That's just what I've said." What was the good of showing them puzzle in his lion's skin? They would only tear him to pieces. "That's taken the wind out of our sails," whispered Eustace. "The ground is taken from under our feet," said Trinian.
Cursed cleverness," said Poggin. "I'll be sworn that this new lie is of Ginger's making."
And there we have the end of the chapter. Next week, we'll be hearing Chapter 10, Who Will Go Into the Stable. Don't miss out. Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. The M.R. James Collection. Ghost Stories by the Master of British Horror. Only on the Black Dog Chronicles. Look out for the shadows.